At my husband's will reading, my stepdaughter slid a document across the table and said, "Sign it, or you get nothing." I picked it up, folded it neatly, and leaned back in my chair. Everyone in the room was waiting for me to panic, but I didn't. Instead, I looked right at her and said, "That's funny, considering what I found in his safe last night. My name is Clara Whitmore. I am 49 years old, a widow, and until recently, a high school English teacher trying to live a quiet, steady life. When I married Richard 15 years ago, I thought we had built something strong together. He was older than me, successful in business, and at times difficult, but he had a charm and a kindness that made me fall in love with him. For years, I cared for him through illnesses and setbacks, never once doubting that we were partners in every sense of the word. But with Richard came his daughter, Haley. She was 27 now, but from the moment I entered her life, she made it clear I was unwelcome. To her, I was an outsider who had married her father for money. I tried everything I could to bridge the gap. I invited her to dinners. I sent her birthday gifts. I even stepped aside when she wanted her father's attention, believing that time and patience would soften her heart. Nothing worked. Every look she gave me was sharp. Every word was laced with suspicion. Richard always told me not to take it personally. "She'll come around one day," he would say, brushing my hair back with his hand when I was tired. But deep down, I knew Haley never would. She didn't see me as his wife. She saw me as a threat. When Richard passed away, my world cracked open. Losing him was painful enough, but I also knew I was about to face the storm Haley had been waiting years to unleash. I leaned heavily on my sister Margaret during those first weeks. She was my rock, the one who reminded me I had value outside of Richard's shadow. I remember one evening, sitting at her kitchen table over tea. "Clara," she said, her voice firm but gentle, "you gave Richard more than anyone ever could. Don't let Haley convince you otherwise. Don't let her rewrite your place in his life." I wanted to believe her. I wanted to trust that Richard had left things in order, that he had protected me the way he promised. But a part of me knew Haley wasn't going to let this go easily. The will reading was coming, and I could already feel her claws reaching for everything he left behind. When the day arrived, I walked into the lawyer's office with my heart pounding, but my head held high. I told myself I would endure whatever came. I had no idea that before the meeting ended, Haley would try to strip me of everything: my security, my dignity, and the very life Richard and I had built together. The room where the will reading was held smelled faintly of old leather and paper, the kind of place that carried weight and history. I sat at the long oak table, my hands resting on my lap, trying to steady the nervous energy crawling under my skin. Richard's lawyer, Mr. Carter, shuffled through a stack of folders, his voice calm and professional as he began to read. My sister Margaret sat quietly behind me for support, her presence like a steady anchor. On the other side of the table, Haley leaned back in her chair, her arms crossed, her eyes cutting into me like knives. Mr. Carter began with the formalities, speaking about Richard's assets, his investments, and the small charitable donations he had set aside. My mind drifted as I listened. It was surreal to hear my husband's life reduced to lines in a document, numbers and signatures that determined who he was leaving behind. I felt the ache of missing him swell in my chest. Then came the moment everything shifted. Mr. Carter hesitated slightly before announcing that Haley had brought forward an additional document. She reached into her sleek black purse and pulled out a folded paper. Without a word, she slid it across the table toward me. The sound of it brushing over the wood was sharp, final, almost cruel. I picked it up with trembling fingers. The document was simple, but devastating. A waiver stating that if I signed, I would agree to a small settlement, just enough to live on, while relinquishing any claim to Richard's estate, including the home I had lived in for 15 years. Haley's voice was smooth, rehearsed, dripping with false sympathy. "Clara, this is what Dad would have wanted. He always said the family estate should stay in the bloodline. You'll be taken care of course, but this is about protecting his legacy." My stomach tightened. I could hardly believe what I was hearing. This wasn't Richard's voice. These weren't his words. Richard had promised me, time and again, that I would be safe, that I wouldn't have to fight for scraps after he was gone. I looked across the table at Haley, her lips curled in a small, confident smile. She wasn't mourning her father. She was seizing her victory. I placed the paper back on the table and said quietly, "That doesn't sound like Richard. He told me himself he wanted me to stay in the home, that he wanted me to have security." Her eyes narrowed. "He said a lot of things, but this," she tapped the paper with her perfectly manicured nails, "this is what matters. Sign it, Clara. Don't make this harder than it has to be." Margaret leaned forward behind me, her voice sharp. "This is outrageous. Richard would never have cut Clara out like this." Haley ignored her completely. Her gaze stayed locked on, waiting, daring me to give in. My heart was pounding so loudly, I could barely hear the ticking clock on the wall. I thought of the nights I sat by Richard's bedside, when his body was failing him, holding his hand, whispering words of comfort. I thought of the meals I cooked when he was too weak to eat, the bills I managed when he was too tired to think. Haley hadn't been there for those moments. She visited occasionally, yes, but she didn't live through the daily struggle, the quiet sacrifices, the endless devotion. And now, she wanted to erase me with one signature. The lawyer cleared his throat, uncomfortable. "Mrs. Whitmore, it is, of course, entirely your decision, but I must advise you to read carefully before you sign." I felt a surge of humiliation and anger. Did they all expect me to just agree? Did they all see me as the helpless widow, grateful for whatever crumbs were thrown my way? I glanced at Haley again. She leaned forward slightly, her eyes gleaming with triumph, as though she had already won. In that moment, a shift happened inside me. The grief and fear that had weighed me down since Richard's death suddenly gave way to something else, resolve. I couldn't let her take everything from me. Not after all I had given, not after all I had endured. I pushed the paper back across the table, my hands steady now. "This isn't what Richard wanted," I said firmly. Haley's smile faltered, just for a second. "You're being foolish, Clara. Without this, you'll get nothing. Do you understand? Nothing." I looked at her, and instead of breaking, I felt strength rise in me. "We'll see about that." The room grew tense, the silence heavy. Haley thought she had cornered me, but she had no idea that I wasn't as powerless as she believed. What she didn't know, what no one in that room knew, was that the night before, I had opened Richard's safe, and what I found inside would change everything. The paper still sat on the table between us, its presence heavy like a stone. Haley watched me with the certainty of someone who thought she had already won. I could almost hear her thoughts. "Clara is weak. Clara is alone. Clara will fold." For a moment, I almost wanted to laugh at how little she knew me. She had underestimated me from the day I entered her life, and this time would be no different. I straightened in my chair and pressed my hands flat against the cool surface of the oak table. My pulse slowed, my mind sharpened. The fear that had wrapped around my chest like chains was loosening, because unlike Haley, I knew something she didn't. I wasn't sitting there unarmed. The night before, unable to sleep, I wandered into Richard's study. His things were still untouched, the smell of his cologne lingering faintly in the air. On the wall was the safe he had kept for years. Most people thought only Haley had the code, but Richard had told me the combination once during one of his weaker nights, when he trusted me with his secrets. At the time, I hadn't thought much of it, but something in my heart told me to open it that night. Inside, I found envelopes stacked neatly, his handwriting on the front of each. Some were financial papers, receipts, and old contracts, but one envelope stood out. It had my name written across it in his bold, unmistakable script, Clara. My hands shook as I pulled it out, my breath catching in my throat. Inside were two things: an official notarized amendment to his will, and a personal letter he had written to me in his final days. The amendment was clear. Richard left me ownership of our home, the majority of his savings, and instructions that I be financially secure for the rest of my life. It was signed, dated, and witnessed. Legally binding, undeniable. He had thought ahead. He had protected me. The letter was short, but powerful. In his shaky handwriting, he had written, "To my wife Clara, who gave me love when I had little left to give, who stood by me when my health failed, who cared for me when no one else did. I leave the life we built together. Do not let anyone make you believe you don't deserve it." I had read those lines again and again, tears soaking the page. That letter wasn't just protection, it was Richard's final promise to me. And now, sitting at that table with Haley's smug face staring at me, I realized I wasn't scared anymore. I was ready. I leaned back in my chair, folding my hands calmly in my lap. My silence stretched out long enough to make Haley fidget. She tapped her nails impatiently on the wood, glancing at her lawyer for reassurance. Margaret's steady presence behind me felt like a shield, but I no longer needed her to hold me up. I had found my own strength. Finally, I smiled. Not a wide smile, but a quiet, knowing one. I pushed the paper Haley had given me back across the table and said softly, "I'll think about signing, but before I do, there's something everyone here should know." Haley's brow furrowed. "What are you talking about?" I reached down to my purse resting by my chair. My fingers brushed against the envelope inside, the weight of Richard's letter and documents pressing against my palm like a secret weapon. I let the suspense linger a moment longer, letting her stew in the uncertainty. "You've spent years treating me like I was nothing," I said, my voice clear and steady, "like I didn't matter to your father, like I had no place in his life. But Richard didn't see me that. He made sure of it, and I have proof." Her lawyer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, sensing the ground beneath him was about to give way. Margaret leaned forward slightly, her face lighting with hope. Haley, on the other hand, went pale, though she quickly masked it with a scowl. "Proof?" she scoffed, though her voice wavered. "What kind of proof?" I didn't answer right away. Instead, I reached into my purse and pulled out the envelope. I laid it gently on the table, sliding it forward just enough for everyone to see Richard's handwriting on the front. The room went silent. "This," I said, my hand resting on the envelope, "is what Richard left me. And before this meeting is over, you'll understand exactly what it means." Haley's confident mask cracked. She shifted in her seat, her lips tightening, her knuckles white where her hands gripped the arms of the chair. She had come here expecting to corner me, but now the roles were shifting. For the first time since Richard's death, I felt the weight of grief ease just a little, because even in his absence, he had not abandoned me. He had given me the strength to stand tall, the truth to silence her lies, and the proof to end this cruel game. And as I sat there, watching Haley squirm, I realized the turning point had arrived. She thought she had written the ending of this story, but I was about to prove her wrong. The envelope sat between us on the table, a small object that suddenly carried the weight of everything Richard had left behind. My fingers lingered on it for a moment before I pulled it open. The room was so quiet that I could hear the faint rustle of the paper as I unfolded it. Across the table, Haley's smug confidence began to falter. She leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as though trying to see what I held before I said a word. I cleared my throat and spoke clearly, letting every syllable cut through the air. "This is a notarized amendment to Richard's will, signed and dated. It names me as the rightful heir to our home, to his personal savings, and to a portion of his estate." Haley blinked rapidly, shaking her head as though she could simply deny what I had said. "That can't be true. Dad never would have done that without telling me." I met her gaze, unflinching. "He didn't tell you because he knew exactly how you would react. He wanted me to be protected, and he made sure of it." Mr. Carter, the lawyer, reached for the document with hesitant hands. His eyes scanned the pages quickly, his expression shifting from skepticism to recognition. "This appears authentic," he admitted quietly. "It bears the proper signatures and the official seal. This would override any earlier drafts." Haley's face flushed a deep red. She turned sharply toward him. "There has to be a mistake. You said—" He cut her off with a raised hand. "Miss Whitmore, I was not aware of this document. If it is valid, then your stepmother's rights are clear." The room grew heavy again, but this time the weight wasn't pressing down on me. It was pressing down on Haley. Her composure cracked as she gripped the edge of the table, her voice sharp and trembling. "This is unfair. She doesn't deserve it. She was never part of this family." The words stung, but I steadied myself. My hands no longer shook. My voice no longer faltered. I leaned forward slightly, placing Richard's handwritten letter on top of the amendment. "Read this, then tell me I wasn't part of his family." I began to read aloud, my voice soft but firm. "To my wife Clara, who gave me love when I had little left to give, who stood by me when my health failed, who cared for me when no one else did. I leave the life we built together. Do not let anyone make you believe you don't deserve it. Tears welled in my eyes as the words filled the room, but they weren't tears of weakness. They were tears of vindication. I folded the letter carefully and set it aside. Richard wrote that with his own hand. That was his truth, and no document you try to push across this table will erase it. For once, Haley had no words. Her mouth opened as if to argue, but nothing came out. Her eyes darted to the lawyer, then back to me, then to Margaret, who sat proudly behind me with her arms crossed. Margaret spoke up then, her voice steady and strong. Richard's love for Clara was obvious to everyone who truly cared about him. You may not have wanted to see it, Haley, but your father did everything he could to make sure she was cared for. That was his choice, and it's time you respected it. The lawyer straightened his tie uncomfortably. Given these documents, there is nothing more to discuss. Mrs. Whitmore's inheritance is secure. Haley's chair scraped loudly against the floor as she stood, her face twisted in anger. This isn't over, she hissed, her voice shaking. She snatched her purse from the chair and stormed toward the door, muttering under her breath. I sat still, my hands resting lightly on the table. I felt no need to rise, no need to chase her or defend myself further. The truth was on the table now, literally. Richard's words, his signature, his final act of love stood as my shield. When the door slammed behind her, silence filled the room again. But this silence was different. It wasn't heavy with fear or tension. It was calm, like a storm had passed. Mr. Carter cleared his throat softly. Mrs. Whitmore, he said, his voice now laced with respect. I'm sorry you were put through this today. Your husband's intentions are clear. You have nothing to fear. I nodded, my throat tight with emotion. Thank you, I managed. Margaret leaned forward, placing her hand gently over mine. You handled that with more grace than most people ever could. I looked at her, then back at the documents, then finally at the letter. A warmth spread through me, not just from winning, but from knowing Richard's voice had spoken louder than Haley's schemes. I whispered to myself, he kept his promise. And in that moment, I knew the fight was over. Not just the legal battle, but the fight within myself. The fear that I was invisible, that I was unwanted, that I didn't belong. Richard's final words had erased that doubt forever. When the door slammed behind Haley, the sound lingered in my ears like the last clap of thunder after a storm. For weeks, I had carried the fear of this day, the fear of losing everything I had built with Richard, the fear of being erased by someone who never wanted me to belong. But as I sat there, at that long oak table, the documents, and Richard's letter spread out in front of me, I realized the storm had passed, and I was still standing. Mr. Carter quietly gathered his papers, avoiding my eyes as though ashamed of what had nearly happened. He muttered something about following up with official filings, and then excused himself. I barely noticed. My focus wasn't on him anymore. It was on the weight that had lifted from my chest. For the first time since Richard's death, I could breathe without dread pressing down on me. Margaret moved from her chair behind me to sit at my side. She took my hand and squeezed it gently. It's over, Clara, she said softly. She can't touch you now. I nodded, but tears filled my eyes anyway. They weren't tears of fear this time. They were tears of relief, of exhaustion, of gratitude that Richard's last act had been to protect me. I whispered, almost to myself, he didn't forget me. He didn't let her win. Later that evening, back in the quiet of my home, I walked slowly through each room. The house no longer felt like a place I might lose. It was mine, legally, securely, but more importantly, emotionally. Every wall carried memories. Dinners Richard and I had shared. Nights we had spent talking. Mornings where sunlight spilled into the kitchen as he read the newspaper. For weeks, I had been afraid those memories would be stripped from me. Now, I knew they were safe. I paused in Richard's study, the safe still tucked quietly against the wall. I ran my fingers over the cool metal door, remembering how my hands had trembled when I opened it, how his handwriting had steadied my heart when I saw my name on that envelope. That letter would stay with me always, not just as proof in a legal battle, but as his final declaration of love and trust. In the days that followed, the house grew quiet again. Haley didn't call. She didn't visit. And honestly, I didn't expect her to. She had built her world on resentment, and losing this battle would only feed her anger. A part of me ached for her. I knew the pain of losing a parent, and I knew grief could twist people in ugly ways. But another part of me knew that what she had tried to do wasn't grief, it was greed, and I couldn't carry the burden of forgiving her just yet. Instead, I focused on myself. I spent afternoons in the garden Richard and I had planted together, pulling weeds, planting new flowers, reminding myself that life continues to grow even after loss. I called Margaret often, grateful for her steady wisdom and the way she reminded me to laugh. I returned to teaching part-time because standing in front of a classroom gave me purpose, reminded me that I could still shape futures even when my own felt uncertain. One afternoon, as I was arranging flowers in a vase, the phone rang. I hesitated before answering, half expecting more legal nonsense. But when I picked it up, a quiet male voice came through. "Clara, this is Daniel, Richard's son." For a moment, I froze. Daniel, Richard's son from his first marriage, had been distant for years, living out of state, avoiding family conflict. I hadn't heard his voice in so long that it startled me. "Daniel?" I said cautiously. "Hello." There was a pause on the other end, then a sigh. "I heard what happened with Haley. I think we should talk. Maybe about Dad. Maybe about you. I don't want things to end the way she tried to make them." My throat tightened. I didn't know if his call was the beginning of healing or just another complication. But unlike before, I wasn't afraid of what was to come. I had learned something vital in that lawyer's office, something Richard's letter had sealed into my heart. My worth wasn't defined by Haley's approval or by anyone else's. I had spent too long believing I had to keep proving myself to belong, when in truth, I already belonged to the life Richard and I had built. I took a deep breath and said, "All right, Daniel, let's talk." After I hung up, I sat quietly by the window, watching the evening light fall across the garden. The future still held uncertainty, but I no longer faced it with fear. I had stood up for myself when it mattered most. I had honored Richard's love and protected the life we shared. The lesson was clear, and I carried it with me every day after. Sometimes, people will try to push you out of your own story, but you don't have to let them. Love, loyalty, and truth are stronger than lies, and dignity is worth defending, even when it costs you everything else. As the last of the daylight faded, I whispered softly, almost like a prayer, "I kept your promise, Richard, and I'll keep it still."